Welcome everyone to the 4 at 4 Forum, starring guest host Jane Wells. With Jane today, Joe Ferullo, Joe Garner, and Nicholas Symphonic Wins. And now, here's Jane.
Thank you, Mike. Thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. And it turned out, by the way, confession, I am going to continue wearing this shirt until Joe Kelly is back on the mound again. So you may not want to get too close to me over the next couple of weeks. It's a great opportunity and evening, actually, to be talking about podcasting because iHeartMedia, the largest podcast company out there, just came out with some new numbers today, pretty staggering numbers if they are to be believed. Over half of Americans have listened to a podcast. It is 155 million people. In the last month, more than a third of the country listened to an episode of a podcast. That's 104 million people. But in that group over the last month, the 12 to 24 age demo, almost half are listening to podcasts just in the last month. So it really does skew younger. We have a unique panel here this afternoon from the creative side to marketing to strategy. And we're also going to listen to some great music. I want to start with a quick round robin so you can meet all of our experts who will tell you very briefly who they are and their exposure to podcasting and why we all seem to think this is here to stay if you can do it right. Joe Ferullo, I'm starting off with you. Tell us about yourself.
Joe Ferullo. I was Executive Vice President at CBS for programming in the syndicated division. One of the things we did in our talk shows, Dr. Phil, Rachel Ray, Entertainment Tonight, and a whole bunch of others, was make the transition to podcasts because that's become more and more a way younger viewers, younger listeners are learning about personalities and content. So it's an important part of development and network as well.
Joe Garner, you're up.
I started out my career in broadcast and took an unexpected turn into publishing, which lasted about 18 years. And so podcasting just became sort of a natural extension of storytelling. So I've loved it. Enjoy every minute of it.
And you've had quite some success about it, which we're going to talk about. And you've taken a deep dive into some of the analytics. Nicholas D'Augusto, your turn. Tell us about yourself and your involvement in podcasting.
Hi there. I've been a professional television film actor for almost 20 years now. You've seen me in shows like Gotham, Masters of Sex. I've been in films like Election, where I got my start, Fired Up, and Final Destination 5. We have a little clip from my most recent show where I was the lead in an NBC sitcom called Trial and Error for a couple of seasons. It was opposite John Lithgow in the first season, Kristen Chenoweth in the second season, and the clip has John in it. So let's watch that.
But that's where it is, and I will do everything that I'm able to for as much time as I have left, and that's that. And then I always finish with, when I wake up in the morning, and the last thing I do before I go to bed, I thank God for every day of life that I am given, period. That day of life, period.
So, to be able, we're jumping way into the deep end on that one, Jay, but ultimately, that's a taste of what I'll be able to talk about more later. If you want to go back and run the Lithgow thing now, you can do it now, or you can run it later. But there's a little scene from the first season of Trial and Error whenever you get a chance.
Let's try and run that now.
Hi, Larry.
Hi, Josh.
How are you doing?
Oh, I don't know. I consider myself to be a positive person, but this constantly getting arrested for violent crimes is starting to really bum me out.
Me too. I was really hoping to just focus on one case, but apparently I'm now working on two.
Next thing you know, they're going to bring up that hit and run I got away with last year.
I didn't hear that.
That hit and run that I got away with last year. No one died. I was driving with my skates on.
No, I can't hear that. Oh, hey. What are you doing here?
I came to retrieve the thumb drive you stole.
You mean the thumb drive you've been...
Well, listen, you got out of the steamy scene with Jayma Mays there just in time, I'm telling you.
It's we're going to go PG-13 shortly.
That's right. Anyway, I'm also a podcaster. I have a show called God and Other Delicacies, I'll talk more about that. We've already heard a little bit about it already, so we'll pass the horn back to Jane. But ultimately, I'm just very excited to be doing something I'm very passionate about, and I'll talk more about it later.
Yeah, to go from that to talking about God in a podcast shows an incredible range. And also John Lithgow, who to me will always be Trinity on Dexter, and I cannot ever be in the same room with him ever. But hilarious guy, great actor, and the two of you together were great. Me, very briefly, I have been a television reporter my entire life. I've spent the last 20 plus years at CNBC. I fell in love with podcasting when I listened to the first season of Serial. In 2018, CNBC decided to figure out if there's money to be made in podcasting. It dipped its toe in it, and we decided to turn a video franchise I'd done for the network called Strange Success into a podcast, a couple of seasons of podcast episodes. Strange Success is about, it's like How I Built It, but with really weird things. It's like the Squatty Potty. Well, I should say the most successful episode of the podcast was the one episode we could not put on television, and you'll see why. We have a graphic of it. It was about the most expensive, best-selling, lifelike sex dolls in America. They're made by a company. Yeah, there you go. See, that's why we couldn't put it on TV. But it was great for audio. Matt Millen there, he makes them down in northern San Diego County, and he is ringing in the cash, especially during the pandemic. Lately, though, I have also gone off into my own podcast effort. It's called Top Story Tonight, where I take modern media and social media and kind of mock them and transport them back in history to cover great events in history. The latest one is Top Story Tonight, Jesus, who I would argue was the original social disruptor and the most viral story ever told. We're in production now. Here is a clip of what the montage opening for the Christmas episodes will sound like. And by the way, that's King Herod who's talking about fake news, and he tweets at 3 a.m. if you can take a listen.
Fake news. Fake news. I'm not surprised to hear that from you. Your network is very unpopular. My family converted to Judaism 2 generations ago. I'm very observant. You should observe me being observant. You don't give me enough credit for that. It's about time I have some positive press here.
Okay, that's an unmixed raw clip from the actor. By the way, for those of you who say, gee, why are you making King Herod Trump? In the Easter story, his son Herod Antipas, who kills John the Baptist, is Bill Clinton, who loves the ladies and has a very ambitious wife who makes their enemies disappear. We will talk more about that. I've launched a successful campaign on Kickstarter to fund it. By the way, thank you for those who've supported. But let's dive in to some of the lessons learned from the four of us over the last few years. Joe Garner, I'm going to start with you because you have really taken a look at the numbers and done your research. What would you say are the three most important things someone has to consider before starting a podcast?
Right. Well, there are, I see podcasting as sort of a three-legged stool, Jane. The first thing that you have to pay most attention to is your why. Whether you're doing it for personal reasons or business reasons, you need to know why you're doing it. You have to be crystal clear on it. The reason you have to be crystal clear on your objective is because most podcasts don't last past the 7th episode, because people discover it takes work. You have to have something to say. So that brings me to the next most important aspect. They say the political expression, it's the economy stupid. Well, in podcasting, it's the content stupid. I mean, unless your podcast is current events focused, I often recommend that people map out their first 3 to 6 months of whatever their podcast is going to be, because if it's a struggle, that tells you that you might want to rethink it. And if you glide through it, on the other hand, you find that you've got more ideas and topics, then you're probably going to have an easier time of it. But even at that, you want to be very objective. There's over 1.5 million podcasts out there. Whatever your podcast is, whatever your topic is, you've got to be able to cut through. There has to be a differentiator. And so find that friend of yours, always, either critical or critical, and let them sort of, pass this in front of them to see what their, what their feelings are about it. Make sure that it is something that you feel that people will need to listen to. And then the last thing, and really important is a plan for discoverability. Again, an old expression, if a tree falls in the forest, as I said, there's a million podcasts. So you either want to leverage the social media that you have, if you're fortunate enough to have a huge sphere of influence, or you look for podcasts that are successful, that have the audience that you want, and develop some sort of a reciprocal promotional relationship with them, or put a budget to it and go out and buy ads on successful podcasts that have the audience that you already want. Make a deal with them. There's, it's still the Wild West out there. So you can buy the ad, you can voice it or have them voice it. And then you can even potentially negotiate to have them attach your podcast to their stream. So so those are the three things that you want to pay attention to. Most.
Can you give me an example? And I wonder how much it costs to promote a podcast on another podcast. I'm sure it depends on Joe Rogan would be completely ridiculous, but what does it cost? And give me an example. Walk me through how you have used that strategy for the podcasts you've worked on.
Well, fortunately for me, I haven't had to do that. The podcasts, among the podcasts that I have developed, again, looking back to my publishing career, I was well aware of a series of books called For Dummies. I'm sure we're all familiar with that series. It's been around forever, and a global brand. And so I licensed the entire For Dummies book series from Wiley Publishing and was able to leverage the popularity of that brand. And the same with the podcast that I do with the real life inspiration for the movie Rudy. Fortunately, there's about 4.5 million people on Facebook that list Rudy as their all-time favorite. So we were able to leverage just the brands themselves and the goodwill that they have. But to answer your question, it's math. You contact the podcast. Typically, they have some sales rep. They'll be able to tell you what their download count is. And then it's a very typical media equation of cost per thousand. Getting into the weeds here, I actually have developed a PDF that if people want to leave their email addresses, I'm happy to shoot them the PDF that'll take them through this. But it's a negotiation, and it costs anywhere from a few $100s to tens of thousands of dollars. If you buy somebody like a Joe Rogan, of course.
Before we go to a musical interlude, do you have to have a big following? What's sort of the metric before you can make money on a podcast?
Well, Jane, it depends on what your objectives are. If your objective is to make money through advertising sales, then you're not going to get on anybody's radar unless you're doing anywhere from 10,000, 15,000 in downloads each episode. And they give you anywhere from 45 days to 60 days to be able to accumulate that number. So that's the threshold for ad support. But otherwise, it depends on your motivations. Like, for instance, Ford company is reintroducing their Bronco, which they haven't had out for 25 years. So they're reintroducing it by doing a 6-part podcast documentary called Bringing Back Bronco. And in that case, it's just about bringing attention. If you have a law firm, for instance, and you have a certain niche business, maybe estate planning or something like that, you don't need that big of an audience. To wrap it, I think of, you stand on a stage, right now, if you've got 130 downloads per episode, you're doing better than 50% of podcasts out there.
Wait.
So
130 downloads per episode puts you in the top half. But you need 10,000 to 15,000 downloads per episode.
It sounds daunting because there are 1.5 million.
Wow. Okay.
To attract an advertiser. Yeah.
Right.
Unless you're doing it, like I said, direct. If you're doing direct, then, if you're standing in a room, let's say you were a presenter, you were standing in a room and you had 500 people or 1,000 people in your audience, you'd feel pretty good about that. So it really all depends on what your objectives are. That determines what the audience value is.
Great, Joe. Joe, thank you. By the way, speaking of the Ford Bronco, I was in a news Bronco chasing the OJ Bronco, and to me, that will always be the Bronco, and that is an interesting brand barrier. They may have to overcome, at least in Los Angeles. We're going to ask Joe Ferullo about the big picture, what large networks are doing. But first, we are going to take here's some music from the LA Symphonic Winds. Here's conductor Stephen Piazza. Stephen, what can you tell us about the group?
Out of a group that originally met at Los Angeles Pierce College, as a matter of fact. But when over time it looked like the college was more interested in doing things more geared to recent high school graduates and not involving community members so much, I took the band Rogue, as a matter of fact, and now we have a group of about, well, over 90 musicians, first-rate players who have studied over the years and in many cases gone into other careers, but in many cases are still musicians. So we would meet on a once-a-week basis, and this has been going on now for I should say quite a few years. We'll hear some clips, I believe, from 2010, but the group goes back way before that. So we hope you enjoy the clips that we're going to play for you today. And also, I'm going to get a chance to play clarinet for you today, too, which is nice.
Live music?
Almost live. Let's put it that way. I'm wearing a similar shirt, so perhaps that will fool you into thinking it's live.
Look, when I'm on television and I go to live and tape, people can never tell that. They think that it's all live. I think we're going to run a clip now. Do you know what we're going to hear now?
Well, it's either a piece by Shostakovich called Galop, which is a very exciting piece, or we're going to do a piece by Manuel de Falla, so Ritual Fire Dances. So one of those two, I believe.
I believe it's tango. We're going to hear
then
tango.
This is me playing the clarinet, as a matter of fact. I made an arrangement of a wonderful work by Piazzolla, is the name of the Argentine composer. And I don't know if my son Paul was trying to put videos to this. I don't know if he ended up doing that or not. But anyway, you'll get to hear some great tango music. It runs about 3 minutes. Hope you enjoy it, Jane.
All right, let's listen. Thank you, Stephen. I didn't realize that I never thought of a clarinet solo could be so tango-ish, and we will hear more later. We are going to dive back into it now. We have actor and podcaster Nicholas D'Agosto. We have Joe Garner, 6-time New York Times bestselling author. We have Joe Ferullo, former executive at CBS and NBC, and me. Joe Ferullo, you next. I mean, you're from 30,000 feet. What are the big networks doing in podcasting? Where are they putting their money?
Well, they're putting big money because that's what we do at big networks, Jane. But it's a couple of different areas, and some are more successful than others. As you know, and as I'm sure a lot of our viewers know, it's a tumultuous time in media. So all the big networks are looking for different ways to make money and get talent out there. One way that hasn't been as successful, and again, a lot of listeners and viewers may be aware of this, is what's called a strip podcast. So you take a half hour of Entertainment Tonight, let's say, or the CBS Evening News, and you strip the audio and you throw it up and you call it a podcast. It's cheap, so whatever money you're making is sort of found money, and that's always great in the network world, in any business world. But it's not as effective. It's not helping you sell your brand. It's not giving your brand an additional value. What's working better is the talent that you have that can translate to podcast. Podcasting is like radio. It's a very intimate medium. So if you have a storytelling talent or a passion on a subject that you can convey almost one-on-one in a conversational way to the listener, then it's going to work. A couple of quick examples. Dateline, where I used to work, just began doing podcasts. My friend Josh Mankiewicz did the first one. And it was a several-part murder story with all the atmospherics that we love about podcasting now, the music, the dramatic pauses, perfect. And Josh is a great storyteller. His voice is great. His writing is great. Closer to my business at CBS, Dr. Phil began a podcast about 2 years ago, 18 months ago. That showed a different side of him, allowed him to stretch his wings. So rather than that sort of tough kind of mean guy you see on television, this is an interview podcast. And he does a lot of celebrities and sports celebrities, which is a passion of his. And you see a different side of him, much more conversational, much more one-on-one, much more intimate. It's something he couldn't do every single day on his daytime syndicated show, but sees success in this area. And it just allows him to show a different side of himself to the audience. And that's been successful because, again, it plays off the strengths of podcasting, which is storytelling, intimacy, conversation.
Are you surprised who does not succeed? You know, Dr. Phil, it worked, but maybe someone else you think, oh, this person would be great. And then have you had some failures as well?
No, I haven't been surprised because the failures in podcasting are like the failures in talk shows. And this is not about you, Jane, but most news people fail spectacularly at talk shows because they're news people, right? They've been trained to read prompter and tell you what's going on in a very non-emotional, direct way that lacks a point of view or passion, right? That's not what news is about. And every anchor I've ever worked with came into my office when I was at CBS and said, I know I can do a talk show. And I have to politely tell them, I know you can't, because it's not what you do well. Now bring me a radio host, and yes, they can probably do a TV talk show because they know how to speak one-on-one to an audience.
True, but I'm also thinking, you know, if you are in a position where you're a Josh Mankiewicz and you're going to do this 6-part thing outside of that requires immense resources on the part of NBC to do that. So that's heavy lifting on their part to make that thing come to life.
But to touch on what Joe Garner was saying earlier, Jane, distribution is the key, right? So if it could be well produced, but if no one hears it, it doesn't matter. Josh and Dateline have the platform, as Dr. Phil has, of a television show that's immensely popular. So that can be promoted on Dateline. Dr. Phil promotes his podcast on his program. So millions of people who might not otherwise find out about it, find out about that. So it's worth the initial investment to make that podcast experience excellent because you're going to be able to get it in front of millions of people.
Nicholas D'Agosto, I want to go to you next because you started your podcast kind of in one place with maybe one set of marching orders or whatever, and that has now evolved. Briefly take us on that journey on what you've learned.
Yeah, well, I think it's really interesting, first of all, hearing from Joe. First of all, I feel like it's really two very interesting parts of the spectrum. I mean, I'm happy to say that my podcast is in the top 50%. Very humbly, it gets like 2 to 250 downloads in a month. per episode. It feels very humble. At the same time, that's galvanizing to hear about Joe Garner talking about that. On the other side, it is difficult to compete with, or it feels, if you think about things like a competition, it's, I would say, intimidating on some levels to think about Dr. Phil and people like that coming into the world. What I will say is, for me, speaking, what I get to bring here to the show is that mine is almost a compulsion. I have, my show, like I said, is called God and Other Delicacies. The core questions I ask every guest are, what did you have for breakfast? And which is surprisingly, elicits a surprising amount of actionable responses.
It's very personable.
Yeah.
Very personal, I should say.
Yeah, well, that's where I start. It's also quite disarming, exactly where I want them to be. But then I ask, how and when were you introduced to the idea of God in your life? For me, God has always been a really intoxicating question. As a young boy, I was raised in a devout family of Roman Catholics. And later in my life, most recently, before I started my own family, I identified as an atheist. So what I'll say is, as far as the show goes, as far as starting regarding your question, I was asked by the creator of Trial and Error, the person that wrote the show that you saw the clip for, to go in and be his guest on his talk show. I didn't know he had one. Turns out there was one called, he had one on the run out of the Universal lot called Brigade Radio 1. It's an internet radio station. And one thing led to another. And ultimately, I had this idea for a show, and this guy let me start doing it on his platform. Very quickly, I realized that it was a passion that I never knew that I needed in my life, and that it enriches me personally. So the angle that I kind of want to be spinning for those of you that are interested in this topic and interested in engaging in it, you're going to hear a lot of really interesting. I'm learning a lot by listening to everyone here, but it's a challenging medium because it does take a long time to build an authentic audience that's large and can be monetized. But if you have something that truly does mean something to you at the level that my show means to me, it's not, it's that old phrase, right? You know, if you do what you love, you'll never work a day in your life. And so I now have something in my life. And as an actor, as someone that's always been at really at the behest of other people's decisions on whether or not I will get to be paid for my work, I now have a production element to my work, my professional life, and it now influences my ability to connect in the industry and represent myself as something more dynamic as a brand.
Oh, that's fascinating. So it's almost unintentionally a marketing tool for you. Has the pandemic changed the show and grown the audience?
Yeah, I would actually like to hear from Joe on this one, because he seems to have such a good understanding of the analytics on this. From what I've read, podcasts in general dropped at the beginning of the pandemic because so few people were driving in their cars on their way to work. A lot of people listen, as we saw in the iHeartMedia article, that a lot of people do it while multitasking. Well, if you're working out less, probably if you have children at home, you're not going to the gym, you're not driving. You know, things like that, I think, did inhibit some of my listenership, but I do see it increasing again. And I have seen the show grow actually now. And it's, what I can say is that for a show like mine, which is a deeply reflective and meditative show on a person's life journey, really takes you through the tentpole events of a person's life. It can be quite emotional. And something like COVID-19, where we get to, look, I'm going to bring in what my show is. It's a lot about death. It's a lot about reflections on the end of your life. It's an existential show. And in a time like this, where I know that I'm trying to find ways to process exactly all of the information that is flooding me and making me think about my life and my family in new ways, I find personally this exercise in my show as enormously rewarding. And I think that the guests feel that way. And I know that the listeners do too.
And you do get famous people to talk about God, which is not something you always expect in Hollywood. Let's play. We have that clip. Let's play it again. Just a little snippet from your podcast.
But that's where it is. And I will do everything that I'm able to for as much time as I have left. And that's that. And then I always finish with, when I wake up in the morning and the last thing I do before I go to bed, I thank God for every day of life that I am given, period. That day of life, period. And I am grateful for the life I have, and I accept what my life today is, period.
And this,
Wow.
sorry, Jane.
No.
It's a compelling story. I mean, it's a very emotional experience. I'm an emotional guy. I got into acting because I like to emote. Joe obviously was analyzing what parts of podcasts are, some of the things that I certainly respond to. This man, Michael Yajewski, has a really interesting name to pronounce. He goes by Michael Jersey. He and I met a while back. That story you can hear on the podcast, but he was diagnosed with brain cancer 4 years ago. He's had 2 very deep surgeries on the tumor. It is a malignant tumor. He does not know how much time he has left. It was an extraordinary and powerful experience to be on the other side of that conversation, as it often is for me. To me, one anecdote about my life is that when I was very young, I wanted to be a priest. This is, to some extent, the synthesis of my life as a professional actor and communicator, and the emotional connection I've had to people's spiritual life that I've always sort of connected with since I was young.
I want to go to both Joes, but before I do, it sounds to me, Nicholas, that you would like this to be successful, but success is not what's most important to you in this project.
I really responded to something that Joe said, which what Joe Garner said at the beginning, which was, if you had 500 to 1,000 people in a room with you attending a live event, you'd feel pretty good about that. And when I think about the church I grew up in, if I have 250 people that listen to every one of my episodes, that's, and then theoretically we'll only grow from there. That's a really rewarding thought. I've been on shows that have been at varying levels of success, but as an actor, there are so many people that have their hands in the decision-making of what a show is and its success on a larger scale. The power of being able to connect directly, even with just 250 people, is really inspiring. And one thing I will say very briefly is that Joe Rogan, a name that we've talked about on the show already because of his influence, on his show recently, they talked about how important it was for young artists, or what I should say is artists that are new in their podcasting platform. But he also talks about young artists in particular, young comedians, because they're not savvy in the business sense, and they can sell over their rights to their material maybe too soon because of the intention for them to grow their show. And he really advises young artists in particular, but people new with their ideas to podcasting, to plan to grind it out for 2 or 3 years and be very careful. Take the assistance that will come to you, but be very careful to give away your property rights to your idea, because it takes a long time, but when you build that critical mass, then that's when you have something special.
Nicholas, thank you. Joe Ferullo, are you seeing an impact on podcast audiences because of COVID?
Because our lives are less structured, it's better for podcasts, actually. For instance, NPR, their broadcasts in the morning are way down because, as Nicholas was saying, people are not in their cars at drive time. But because they're not in their cars, they have more freedom in their day to select podcasts. So NPR podcasts are way up. Also because they have more time, they're looking for things that resonate more personally with them. It's not just simply, I missed the headlines, let me catch up a podcast and figure out what's going on. So for people who have niche podcasts, like Nicholas's, that speak to a certain passion, there are a lot of people who have time on their hands, who are allowing themselves to break away from their working at home to find something that means something to them at this particular time in our lives, are looking for things like that they can really, really connect to on several different levels. And that's new.
Joe Garner, your thoughts, but I also have a follow-up question for you, because you're working with Rudy now. And Joe Garner, I'm curious, sort of when you, as a producer who is a co-host who's cultivating talent, how do you find the right talent and then make them podcast worthy? So that, I don't know if you want to comment on the COVID thing, but then I definitely want to ask you about finding talent and nurturing it.
Well, if I were out looking for talent and I came across Nicholas, he would be the first person that I would want to sign to do a podcast with. The reason being is because he's an actor, not a broadcaster. With all due respect to the broadcast brethren out there, they have to learn to unlearn some bad habits. He's an actor. He's he emotes, he relates, and he's talking about a subject that is beyond near and dear to his heart. And podcasting, I would suggest, is even more intimate than radio. Radio broadcast is a passive experience. Podcasting, keep in mind, they're downloading you for a very specific reason. So it's a medium where you can take your time, you can let it breathe, you don't have to worry about dead air and things like that. There have been some interesting stats that have come out since COVID. One of the things is that podcasting, I always say, is the great democratizer. The barrier of entry is very low. So anybody and everybody can try it, and anybody and everybody has pretty much tried it or is on the way. So while there's been an uptick in new podcasts, much like Nick suggested, there has been a downward slope in number of new episodes. So these people that started, there's a reason, Jane, that every talent agency in this town has a podcast division now, for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is it's cheap to produce IP. But if you're interested, I can give you just a few more of those stats. When I told you that if you had 130 downloads, you were in the top 50%. If you have 1,100, you're in the top 20%. 3,500, you're in the top 10%. And if you have 5,000, you're in the top 7. So to crack the top 1%, you're looking at about 30 to 40,000 downloads. So, there's a lot out there, but they're not tuning in to a lot of them. It's all about finding that passion and that differentiator.
It's interesting because I feel like podcasts are the blogs that we had 15 years ago. Everybody had a blog, but only a few of them made money. And so we'll see what happens. Although I know, Joe Ferullo, we'll talk about this later. You think podcasting is here to stay. Briefly, my experience, and it's interesting because CNBC has really not figured out what it wants to do about podcasting. It was trying the stripping show that Joe was talking about, putting it on. You just take mad money, you put it on a podcast. They have found the resources that need to be expended. They're not getting the return on investment in general that they want. And so particularly for a podcast like I was doing called Strange Success, which was not just sitting down talking to someone, we were going out and turning it into a multimedia thing where we had 3 camera shoots and all that. And they're also, CNBC is much more interested in YouTube than Apple's a podcast store. So I did a podcast for American Greed, which again was really a vodcast. We did a 3 camera shoot and put it on YouTube because they can monetize that. They see a better return on investment that. What I have learned now on my own doing this Top Story Tonight Jesus project is I have over 100,000 followers on Twitter. They follow me for the most part because I'm on CNBC. Very hard to convert a large number of those people to a Kickstarter program about Jesus. It's funny that there's 2 of us here talking about God. That's quite by coincidence. So to back up very briefly on this project of mine and the Kickstarter campaign is, I had many years ago, I love making fun of the media. I'm in it. I love making fun of it. Many years ago, I created a teleplay before podcasts where I brought these stories of the Old Testament to life with the modern news media existing then. So Adam and Eve hire Johnny Cochran to try and get back in the Garden of Eden. And Jacob, Rachel, and Leah end up on The Bachelor. And David is Conor McGregor facing off against Goliath in the Octagon. And I made a demo with a bunch of friends at KFI, which is another good thing. You want to get talent that has a built-in audience, and to have the number 1 talk show in the 2nd largest media market as your talent is good. So I went and made a demo, and I went to Wondery and Audible, and both of them loved the idea of taking media and retelling history, and both of them said, nobody wants religion. And the woman from Audible said, but why don't you do something like the Mayflower, which I didn't want to, say, Oh, well, there's religion all over the Mayflower, but I thought it was a great idea. So 2 years ago on my own, after a year of research and writing, I funded a podcast called Top Story Tonight, the Mayflower. All the Native American parts were voiced by Native American actors, including Michael Horse from Twin Peaks. It was hilarious. I learned a lot, made a lot of mistakes. A year and a half ago, in the same week, two people came up to me. One said, "Why don't you do one on Christmas?" And another one said, "Why don't you do one on Jesus? I will write a check." And then two friends said, "Why don't you do a Kickstarter for the Jesus thing and we'll kick in?" Well, I figured, okay, I'm being told a message. So I have then went on Kickstarter. It's more than it was completely funded on Kickstarter, which is a whole other story. Kickstarter is a full-time job, people. And because of that, we're now in production for this Top Story Tonight, Jesus. Here is a clip from the Easter episode, because we have to have Joe Rogan in it. In Easter, in 33 AD, he's Joe Roganus, because that's the Roman version of Joe Rogan. And Jesus has been arrested, and he's going to have Peter and John on to talk about him. And Peter's going to deny he knows Jesus 3 times during this podcast. But Joe Rogan, the first 10 minutes of every podcast is all about his endorsements. So comedian Justin Worsham parodies Joe Roganus, and we cut it down to 1 minute. So here's what Joe Rogan's intro of sponsorships and endorsements might sound like 2,000 years ago if he says we don't have the clip. All right, well, I'll send it out. If you want to email me later at jane@janewells.com, I will clue you in. But what I learned about Kickstarter is very different than GoFundMe, which is for charities. Kickstarter is only for projects, creative projects. You have to get it fully funded or you don't get anything at all. You have to constantly refresh it and engage with every network you have. But the best thing about it, besides the money, and thank you, is that it starts to build anticipation for the product long before it actually happens. So people are now aware this is coming. And the most surprising thing, Joe Garner, since you're there, I'll tell you, is the people who said they were going to be in, who were not, and the people who I never expected, who donated. And it's just been much like Nicholas. I hope this finds a following. I'd love to do more on Moses, the Alamo, Lewis and Clark, women's suffrage, everything, you name it. I think it would be a great idea because it mocks the media and it retells history. But that's out of my hands. I can only put the best product I know out there. But unlike what the rest of you do, which is episodic, this is a limited series. So it would be once a year with only, 8 to 10 episodes. And that, again, with Strange Success, I learned is more difficult, that people want regular content. And if you're adding a lot of resources, it's difficult to do. All right, what are we doing on time? Is it time for questions from the audience? Okay. I have a question here. Hold on, audience questions. What's the magic length for podcasts that get downloaded the most? I've heard 30 to 60 minutes. For me personally, 30 minutes, unless I'm going to stop and start while I'm hiking. Joe Ferullo, you are nodding your head. What's the magic?
I agree. 30 minutes seems to work best. People are a little afraid of dipping into something that's 60 minutes long. It's too much of a commitment. 30 is
Nicholas, how long do you run?
Yeah, my show was set up as a 60-minute show. I don't disagree. It's hard to consume. You're asking a lot of the consumer. My shows typically range about 60 minutes, but also I think what's important about that is, for me, I think even more than thinking about a time number is thinking about editing, thinking about making it tight, thinking about making it clean, and also I think really taking out the self-indulgence. Unless you are really in love with a person's personality and willing to go with that person for hours to talk about themselves, I think it's really important. The shows that I've loved make the show all about the guest. And those shows, This American Life, Radio Lab, those are both hour-long shows. So I don't, I'm not intimidated by that, but I do understand that it's harder to chew.
Joe Garner, your thoughts on length?
It's the same. Well, hands down, I typically go with 30 minutes as well. You want it to be the typical commute. People spend the time right or doing their banking, whatever. You want it to sort of coincide with their schedule. That said, one of the questions always sort of shied away from when I've heard from publishers, they'll say to me, if I'm pitching a book project, they'll say, well, how long is the book? And I'll say, well, it's as long as it's going to have to be, So Jane, when you're telling your story, if your story needs to be told in hour-long increments, then it needs to be told in hour-long increments. And the people that tune in for that are going to know that. They're going to sign up for it. And if I may make one more suggestion, I wouldn't make your podcast seasonal. I'd keep your podcast up all the time, because if you do start building up an audience,
it's up all the time, but it's not getting new episodes all the time. So like, for example, the Mayflower.
Okay, good. I misunderstood then.
Yeah. Like the Mayflower has now been up for 2 years, but the Mayflower actually happened 400 years ago this summer. So I've been promoting the hell out of that. We did have a question before we go back to Stephen for some final stuff about the symphonic winds. There was a question about subscription. I have not subscribed to is any podcast behind a pay? Well, I guess the New York Times maybe. I'm trying to think which podcasts are behind a paywall and what works for that. Does anyone raise your hand if you have thoughts on that? Anybody?
Well, I mean, the only thing I can say, I think Joe might have more to say than this. I was just jumping in. But Patreon is one of these things that people will use as essentially a paywall. Sometimes they offer some things. Parts of your show are accessible for free. And sometimes there's a second or third level of paywall. Sometimes it's all paywall right out of the gate. Patreon.
And what would a paywall be? Like $5, $10?
Sometimes shows are $1 an episode, $3 a month, $5 a month, or $2 for additional content, that kind of stuff.
Joe Garner?
I did a subscription. Yeah, we did a subscription podcast for a while. And it was $4.97 a month if you paid monthly. Otherwise, it was $47 thing. It's been a couple of years, so I forget, but that was the annual. But Ben Shapiro actually started out that way. He was on radio here in Los Angeles as a second chair, got booted off and started his podcast and did it as a subscription. And then what he did was he would do part of it ad supported, and then he'd take the other half of it and take it behind the paywall for video. So he was getting revenue streams in all ways, plus store, merchandise, and then of course live event, which is, as soon as COVID is behind us, good Lord willing, that's another really popular revenue stream is live event. And Nicholas, that would be great for you for sure, and Jane for yours as well.
I know that my dad wrote a porno, one of the most hilarious podcasts out there. They have a whole revenue stream with live shows. By the way, if you have never listened to that podcast, it's hysterical. At the end, we're going to all give our final advice, best advice, biggest lesson learned. But first, let's go back to Stephen Piazza to talk about the LA Symphonic Winds. Stephen, are you there?
I am here. And first of all, let me thank you for giving me the opportunity to perform a tango for you. As a member of the Los Angeles Opera Orchestra, it's very rare that I do any tangos by Puccini, Verdi, Wagner, Weber, or Mozart, as a matter of fact. So thank you for that great opportunity. And it's also an opportunity today for me to understand a little bit more about what for me is non-traditional ways of approaching music making. We're used to performing for live audiences and having a family of musicians on stage and a family of, in a sense, of audience members in a live setting, which has been very important and very, very vital to our success. But now, of course, we've had to change our tune, in a sense, to do more things with broadcasting of things and making things available over YouTube and other outlets that we haven't really pursued in the past. And one thing we're going to do this season is we're going to partner with the Los Angeles Unified School District and release videos for them to use through Zoom or whatever medium they're approaching things, in terms of giving lessons to their students who won't be there to get the live lessons. So our horn players will teach horn.
Wow.
Clarinet teachers will teach clarinet, et cetera, et cetera. So we're exploring new avenues to pursue new audiences, and hopefully by releasing on a bi-weekly basis videos of past performances and recent performances, we're able to hang on to that audience. So when we're able to get together again, we'll have a great audience as well as a great musical ensemble.
I think we have a video clip to show.
I hope so.
Oh, hello. My name is Jason Beaumont. I'm a member of the LA Winds, and I'd like to tell you just a little bit about the horn. The French horn, or just the horn as we like to call it, is a member of the brass family. It's a unique instrument for a variety of reasons. First of all, it's the only instrument that plays away from the audience. So what you hear is our reflected sound. You might also notice that the horn is the only brass instrument where the valves are played with the left hand. And the reason for this, it goes back to the olden days when the horn was primarily used as a hunting instrument. Riders would ride on horseback, holding the reins with their left hand, and the coiled compact shape of the horn would rest nicely on their right arm as they rode and played.
Whoa now!
This attribute stayed with the horn when it was introduced to the orchestral setting. Composers over time have made great use of the hunting calls, just like Wagner did in Götterdämmerung.
That's amazing. I mean, I just learned a lot during that. Who knew? We are going to wrap up now. Thank you, Stephen, very much, and best of luck. Wow, I would love to. Now I'm interested in the horn. Who knew? Thank you.
Thank you, Jane.
As we function in this world, and actually having to record a scripted podcast like I did with 21 actors in 21 different home studios, with different sounds in their home studio, has been a COVID challenge, which my audio mixer will enjoy as we get ready to final cut. Last thoughts on everyone. Just very briefly, your final advice. Joe Ferullo, you go first.
Final advice is that podcasts are here to stay, and there will be room enough for everybody who wants to get into it. It's going to be here to stay because, like streaming video, podcasts puts the consumer, the listener, in control. I get to choose what I want to listen to, when I want to listen to it. And that's something that consumers love time and time again. Give them the control and they'll be there. So podcasts are around.
Joe Garner.
If you decide to get into it, make sure that you know why you're getting into it. Make sure you're crystal clear on your objectives. And in order to be successful, you want to make sure that what you're doing is something that your audience just can't live without. So find that person who can be active about what you're doing and have fun with it.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be a huge audience to be successful. It just has to be a rabid. Yeah, it just has to be a consistent or at least a devoted audience. Nicholas, final advice from you.
Yeah, just kind of spinning off that, something I said earlier. I mean, really just kind of find something that is authentically you. For me, I also wanted to engage in a subject that I think is difficult and challenging, something that I know that you were speaking to, Jane. And I find that in an environment like this, people are willing to be receptive to something that's challenging when they're not put front and center. They're allowed to hear something and sneak a peek into somebody else's life. And for me, that's the passion I have. And if you're going to get into this, I would think that you would need a similar type of passion.
I think you're right. People are more receptive to being challenged right now in this environment. I have two bits of advice for me before we play it out with music. One is, if you want to do a podcast, listen to a bunch of podcasts and borrow things you like stylistically. Radiolab has a very tight editing style, which I like, and I've stolen that. Maybe you like the way somebody talks. NPR has the style of where these people want to stutter all the time because they think it makes them sound natural. Well, it works for them. But I would say if you like the way people use music or sound effects, to build theater of the mind. So listen and borrow until you create your own style. And the second and most important thing is I think you need to find a void. What is not being talked about out there, or what can you talk about in a new way? Where's your area of expertise where you have something of value and interest to say, or you can draw out of other people? We've all got Joe Rogan. Where's Jane Rogan? Okay, go find the Black Joe Rogan. Go find the Black Jane Rogan. I mean, these are opportunities and voids out there where it will take some work to find people, fund people, and partner with them. But they exist. So with that, before we go to music, I want to thank our sponsors. One of our sponsors, Los Robles Health System. Los Robles has been awarded an A hospital safety guide. I had both my kids there, by the way, and a kidney stone. Great place. A hospital safety grade for its commitment to keeping patients safe and meeting the highest safety standards in the U.S. This is the 4th time in a row that Los Robles has been recognized and remains the only hospital in Ventura County with an A grade by the Leapfrog Group for hospital safety. Safe, high-quality care has always been right in your own backyard. Los Robles Health System welcomes you and wants to reassure you that your health, safety, and comfort continue to be their top priority. For more information about patient safety at Los Robles and your community hospital, go to losrobleshospital.com. And next Thursday, 4 at 4 presents a panel on healthcare and biotech in our region, moderated by Los Robles' Amy Commons, Vice President of Community, Employer, and Government Relations. Stay healthy and well. See you next Thursday. And Stephen, I think you and Paul are going to, and the Los Angeles Symphonic Winds are going to play us out. So good night and thank you. Please listen.
So while he's queuing this up, I wanted to thank you for listening to the Los Angeles Symphonic Winds. If you want more information about this group, you can go to lawinds.com and you can get our bi-weekly broadcasts. And then when things start up, hopefully sometime in 2021, you'll join us for our live concerts, which are held at the beautiful Calabasas Auditorium, Calabasas High School Auditorium, and also the Gora High School. So I hope you enjoy those things that you're listening to now. I believe you're going to be hearing some music by Dmitri Shostakovich and hopefully something by Manuel de Falla. But thank you so much for your listening, for your attention.